Some folks say the best stories are the quiet ones, tales of ordinary people finding their way through hard times with nothing but grit, kindness, and a little help from someone who cares. This is one of those stories. Set in the Texas Hill Country during the 1880s, it follows a rancher named Silas and a woman named Grace who came west looking for a fresh start. It reminds us that asking for help isn't weakness. It takes courage. And sometimes the healing we need most comes from the person we least expect. Pull up a chair, pour yourself some coffee, and stay a while. For everyone who ever loved someone enough to stay when leaving would have been easier. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a place when something is dying, not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday afternoon on the porch, but something heavier, the kind that presses against your chest and makes breathing feel like work. Silas Drifter knew that silence. He had heard it twice before in his 43 years, once when his mother passed in the back bedroom while the preacher read from Psalms, and again when his young wife Sarah slipped away after only 2 winters together. Now that same silence had crept into his stable, thick as smoke, and it was taking everything his father and grandfather had built. This story begins not with the arrival of hope, but in the moment just before dawn, when a man realizes he has run out of answers. Sometimes that is exactly where we need to be, at the very end of ourselves, before we can see what has been waiting for us all along. The coughing woke him. Not the wet, productive cough of a horse clearing dust from its lungs. This was dry, hollow. The sound of something struggling to pull air through passages that did not want to cooperate anymore. Silas swung his legs off the bed before his eyes fully opened. The floorboards groaned beneath his bare feet, cold even in July. The way old wood gets when it has been sitting in darkness. He did not bother with his boots, just grabbed his flannel shirt from the bedpost and shoved his arms through the sleeves as he moved toward the door. Outside, the sky held that particular shade of purple that comes 20 minutes before sunrise. No stars anymore, but no light either. Just that in-between color that made everything look faded and worn. A rooster crowed somewhere to the east, old Murphy's place. Probably. The sound carrying across the still air. Wind moved through the dry grass along the fence line, making a soft rustling noise like whispered secrets. Any other morning, Silas might have stood on the porch and listened to the world waking up. Not this morning. The stable door hung crooked on its hinges. He had been meaning to fix it for 3 months now. Kept putting it off. Kept telling himself tomorrow. The leather strap that served as a handle felt damp in his palm, morning dew. Or maybe his own sweat. He could not tell anymore. Inside, the smell hit him first. Sickness has a particular odor. Sweet and sour at the same time, like fruit left to rot in a root cellar. It mixed with the familiar scents of hay and horse and manure, turning them into something unrecognizable. Something wrong. Drummer lay in the first stall. Silas stopped walking. In 20 years, he had never seen that horse lie down when someone entered the stable. Drummer was the kind of animal that greeted every visitor with ears forward and nostrils flaring. Curious about who had come to see him. The kind of horse that would nicker softly when Silas appeared, as if to say, "About time you showed up." Now he lay on his side, legs curled beneath him at angles that looked uncomfortable. His ribs moved barely with each labored breath. His eyes stayed closed. Silas crossed the distance between them without remembering the steps. His knees hit the straw beside Drummer's head, and he reached out with a hand that shook despite his best efforts to steady it. The horse's neck burned beneath his palm, not warm, burning. And the pulse that fluttered against his fingers came weak and unsteady, fading in and out like a candle flame in a drafty room. "Easy, boy." The words came out rough. Easy now. Drummer did not respond, did not twitch an ear or shift his weight or give any sign he knew Silas was there. 20 years. This horse had carried him through blizzards and droughts, and one particularly bad night when Silas had made poor choices at the saloon and needed someone to get him home safe. Drummer had done it without complaint, walking slow and steady through the darkness while Silas slumped in the saddle and made promises he could not keep. 20 years. And now this. Silas made himself stand, made himself walk the length of the stable, counting. First stall, Drummer. Down. Second stall, Bella, the young mare he had bought last spring. Down. Her breathing came faster than Drummer's. Shallow little gasps that sounded like paper tearing. Third stall, Cooper. Down. Fourth, Jackson. Down. Fifth, Old Pete. Standing, but barely. His head hung low, and the water in his trough sat untouched, a yellow film forming on the surface. Silas kept counting. 8 horses lay flat. 7 still stood. But they had stopped eating 2 days ago, and their eyes had taken on that dull, glassy look that meant they were checking out, deciding whether to stay or go. 15 horses. 3 generations of careful breeding, of watching which mare threw the strongest foals, of trading and bartering and sometimes going without new boots so he could afford better feed. 15 horses. And Doc Harmon had stood in this very spot 3 days ago, shaking his head, saying words that meant nothing. I have never seen anything like it. Silas, cannot tell you what is causing it, cannot tell you how to fix it. Best thing you can do is pray. That is all I have got. Pray. His mother would have known what to say. She had kept a worn Bible on the table by her bed, read from it every night before sleep. Silas still had that Bible somewhere in a trunk. Maybe. Or on the shelf in the back room where he kept things too precious to throw away but too painful to look at. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the letter. The paper had gone soft from handling, the creases worn thin where he had folded and unfolded it a dozen times. He did not need to read it again, he had memorized every word, but he looked at it anyway. Dear Mr. Dr. Drifter, I accept your proposal. I will arrive on the 2:15 train from Kansas City on the 14th of July. I am not a fancy woman, and I do not require fancy things. I can cook and clean and keep a house in order. I hope that will be enough. Respectfully, Grace Sullivan. Today was the 14th. In 9 hours, a woman he had never met would step off a train expecting to start a new life, expecting a husband with a working ranch and a future to offer, expecting something other than a man who could not save his own horses, standing in a stable that smelled like death, holding a letter full of promises he could no longer keep. Silas folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. He pulled out his father's brass pocket watch. The face was scratched, the chain tarnished, but the hands still kept time. 5:47. The second hand had stopped working months ago, one more thing he had not gotten around to fixing. He lowered himself back down beside Drummer, not touching him this time. Just sitting there with his back against the wooden slats and his hands hanging between his knees, listening to the rooster crow again and the wind whisper through the grass and the awful, rattling sound of his horse trying to breathe. 9 hours until the train. 9 hours to figure out what he was going to tell a woman who had crossed half a country to marry a man who was watching everything he owned slip away. One breath at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. The station platform baked under the afternoon sun. Silas stood beneath the narrow strip of shade from the overhang, turning his hat in his hands. The brim had gone dark with sweat where his fingers kept gripping it. He had changed his shirt before leaving the clean one, the one without holes at the elbows, but he could already feel dampness spreading down his back. 2:15. The schedule board said 2:15. His pocket watch read 2:23. A whistle cut through the heat, long and low. Coming from the east. Silas straightened. His shirt stuck to his skin where it had pressed against the wooden pillar. He peeled himself away and stepped. The train rolled in slow. Brakes squealing, steam hissing from beneath the cars. 3 people stepped off. An old woman in black, clutching a carpet bag. A man in a bowler hat, already pulling out his pocket watch and frowning at it. And her. Grace Sullivan stood on the bottom step for a moment before descending. Calico dress, pale blue, faded at the hem where it had been washed too many times. Brown hair pulled back and pinned, though a few strands had come loose and stuck to her neck in the heat. No smile, no wave. She just stood there with a leather valise at her feet, looking at him. Silas walked toward her, stopped 3 paces away. "Miss Grace." She nodded once. "Mr. Silas." Her voice came out flat, tired. The photograph she had sent with her letter had shown a rounder face, fuller cheeks. The woman in front of him had sharp cheekbones and shadows beneath her eyes that the camera had not captured. He reached for her valise. "I will take that." The weight surprised him. Heavy for its size, not clothes, or not just clothes. Something denser packed inside. He did not ask. The wagon sat where he had left it, the horse flicking its tail at flies. Silas helped her up onto the bench seat, then climbed up beside her. The old leather creaked beneath them. "How far?" she asked. 2 hours, maybe a little more. She turned her face toward the open country stretching beyond the town's edge. Dry grass, brown hills, a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Her chin lifted slightly. Her nostrils flared. She was smelling something. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye, watched the way her brow creased, the way her gaze shifted from the horizon to him, then down to his hands on the reins. He was gripping them too tight, knuckles white. When he looked back at her face, she was still watching his hands. The house smelled like dust and loneliness. Grace stood in the doorway while Silas set her valise down on the floor. The leather made a heavy thud against the wooden planks. He glanced at her, then away. "Bedroom is through there." He jerked his chin toward a door on the left. "I will sleep in the back room. You take the main one." She nodded, said nothing. "I need to check on—" He stopped. His jaw worked, like he was chewing on words he could not swallow. "I will be in the stable if you need anything." Then he was gone. The screen door banged shut behind him, and his boots crunched across the dry ground. Fading toward the outbuilding where his horses lay, Grace stood alone in the middle of a stranger's house. Dishes sat stacked in a tin basin by the window, 3 plates, 2 cups, a skillet with something dried and brown crusted to the bottom. Dust coated the bookshelf against the far wall, thick enough to leave fingerprints. She stepped closer and ran her finger along the spines. Almanacs, a dictionary with a cracked binding. And there, at the end of the row, a Bible so worn the gold lettering on the cover had faded to nothing. She pulled it out. The leather felt soft, almost fragile, and the pages fell open to Psalms someone had folded down the corner of Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd." She put it back carefully. A rocking chair sat in the corner with a wool blanket draped over its arm. The fabric faded where sunlight had bleached it through the window. A woman's touch, maybe, or the memory of one. A man's house. A house where no woman had lived for a long time. Grace walked through it slowly, opening doors one by one. The bedroom he had offered her held a brass bed with a quilt spread across it, handmade, the stitches uneven in places where someone had learned as they went. A bureau with a cracked mirror. A washstand with an empty pitcher. The back room was smaller, just a cot pushed against the wall. a trunk at its foot, a single window looking out at nothing but brown grass and sky. The kitchen had a cast-iron stove, a pump handle over a deep sink, shelves lined with cans and jars, everything functional, everything adequate, nothing extra. Grace stopped at the window above the sink. From here, she could see the stable clearly. The doors hung open. And even from this distance, 50 yards, maybe 60, she caught it. That smell. She had grown up on a farm outside Philadelphia before her parents died. Spent summers with her grandmother in the hills of Pennsylvania, where the old woman kept goats and chickens and one stubborn mule that lived to be 32. Grace knew the smell of animals, knew the difference between healthy and sick. This smell carried death in it. She stood at the window until the light shifted, shadows stretching longer across the yard. Silas did not come back to the house. Once, she saw him walk from the stable to the well, draw up a bucket, and carry it back inside. His shoulders curved forward like he was carrying something heavier than water. Night came slow. Grace lit the oil lamp on the kitchen table and ate cold biscuits she found wrapped in cloth in the cupboard. The butter had gone rancid, so she ate them dry, washing each bite down with water that tasted like iron and limestone. When the last light faded from the window, she went to the bedroom and closed the door. Her valise sat where Silas had left it, by the foot of the bed. She knelt down on the floor beside it and unlatched the clasps. The leather creaked as she lifted the lid. 2 dresses lay folded in one corner, her Sunday calico and the brown wool she would need come winter. A clean chemise, an extra pair of stockings, darned at the heels. The rest of the valise held glass, dozens of jars and bottles, each one wrapped in scraps of cloth to keep them from breaking. She unwrapped them one by one, setting them in rows on the floor. Willow bark, dried and cut into strips, peppermint leaves, still holding their scent after 3 weeks of travel, chamomile flowers, pressed flat and papery, elderflower, yarrow, boneset, things with names her grandmother had taught her to say before she could read. And beneath the bottles, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, the book. Grace lifted it carefully. The leather binding had cracked along the spine, and the pages had yellowed to the color of old cream. She opened to the first page. The handwriting slanted hard to the right. The letters formed in the old style, with loops and flourishes that made each word look like it was running towards something. Herbal Remedies and Treatments, Bridget O'Malley, County Cork, Ireland, begun in the year of our Lord, 1842. Grace ran her finger along the words. The ink had faded from black to purple to something almost brown in places. But it was still legible, still clear. Her grandmother had carried this book across an ocean, fleeing before the worst of the famine that would hollow out Ireland like a rotten tooth. She had added to it for 40 years, filling page after page with observations and recipes and notes written in margins so small Grace needed good light to read them. She turned to the section on livestock. The lamp flame flickered as she read. Outside, something an owl, maybe, or a nightjar called once and fell silent. For fever in horses. The entry began. Prepare a decoction of willow bark, 2 handfuls to 1 quart of water, boiled until reduced by half. Administer while still warm. Repeat every 4 hours until the fever breaks. If accompanied by labored breathing, add dried peppermint 1 handful and allow to steep before straining. Grace kept reading. The clock on the bureau ticked. The night pressed against the windows. 2 o'clock in the morning. She knew because she had been watching the hands move, waiting for something she could not name. Grace closed the book and stood. Her knees ached from kneeling so long on the hard floor. She stretched, feeling her spine crack in 3 places. The oil lamp sat on the bureau. She picked it up, adjusting the wick until the flame burned steady and bright. The house was silent. The back room where Silas slept showed no light beneath the door. Grace walked to the front door and eased it open. The hinges needed oil. They groaned softly, but no sound came from the back of the house. She slipped through and pulled the door closed behind her. The night air hit her face, cooler than she had expected. The stars overhead spread thick across the black sky, more than she had ever seen in Philadelphia. The stable loomed ahead, its doors still hanging open. She walked toward it. The grass crunched dry beneath her boots. The lamp threw a circle of yellow light around her feet, making the darkness beyond it seem even darker. At the stable door, she stopped. The smell rolled out in a wave sickness and sweat and something underneath both, something that made her stomach clench. She stepped inside. The first horse lay in the stall to her left. A big one. Dark-colored, she could not tell more in the lamplight. Its ribs rose and fell in quick, shallow movements. Its eyes stayed closed. Grace knelt beside it, set the lamp on the ground, placed her hand against the animal's neck, burning hot, pulse thready and fast. She leaned closer, lifting the horse's lip to check its gums, pale, too pale, and the breathing that wet, rattling sound when air moved through passages that should be clear. She had heard this before, in Pennsylvania. In her grandmother's barn, the summer the sickness came through and took 3 of the neighbors' draft horses before anyone figured out what to do. Grace sat back on her heels. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. She turned, lamp in hand, and the light fell across a figure standing in the doorway of the stable. Silas, watching her. His face half in shadow, half lit by the flame. Neither of them spoke. Silas did not move from the doorway. The lamplight carved shadows into the hollows beneath his eyes, the stubble on his jaw, the tight line of his mouth. He looked like a man who had not slept in days, probably because he had not. Grace stayed where she was, kneeling beside the sick horse. Her hand still rested on its neck. "You should not be out here." His voice came out rough, scraped raw. "The horse has a fever." "I know what the horse has." She waited. He did not elaborate. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the labored breathing of the animals in their stalls. 8 of them down. Grace had counted on her way in. 8 lying flat. 7 still standing. The numbers matched what the smell had told her from the kitchen window. "Go back to the house," Silas said. "Get some sleep." Grace stood slowly. Her knees protested she had been kneeling too long. She picked up the lamp and walked toward him, stopping just inside the doorway. "I have seen this before," she said. "In Pennsylvania, my grandmother—" "Your grandmother." His face twitched, tired more than angry. "Your grandmother ever run a ranch in Texas, ever deal with horses that cost more than most men make in a year. She kept livestock. Goats, chickens, maybe a milk cow." He stepped aside, making room for her to pass. "This is not Pennsylvania. Miss Grace, go back to bed." She walked past him without another word. The night air felt colder now. Or maybe that was just the conversation sitting like ice in her chest. She did not look back, did not need to. She could feel him watching her cross the yard, could hear the stable doors creak as he pulled them closed behind her. Morning came gray and heavy. Grace woke before dawn, dressed in the dark, and made her way to the kitchen. The stove sat cold, no one had lit it in days, from the look of the ash piled in the grate. She knelt down and cleaned it out, then built a new fire with kindling from the box beside the hearth. The flames caught. Orange light flickered across the kitchen walls, chasing away the shadows. She found oats in a burlap sack in the pantry, a jar of honey on the top shelf. crystallized around the edges, but still good wildflower honey, from the color of it, the kind her grandmother used to keep, a tin of coffee, half empty. She set water to boil and measured out enough oats for two. The coffee was brewing when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway. Same clothes as yesterday, the flannel shirt wrinkled and untucked, the collar askew. He had not shaved, had not slept much either, from the look of him. The skin beneath his eyes had gone purple-gray, and his shoulders hunched forward like a man bracing against a hard wind. He stopped when he saw her at the stove. "You did not have to do that." "I was hungry." Grace stirred the oats with a wooden spoon. "Sit down. It is almost ready." He stood there for a moment, caught between the doorway and the table. Then something in him gave way, not surrender. Just fatigue, and he pulled out a chair. The legs scraped against the floor. Grace ladled oatmeal into two bowls, white ceramic, chipped at the rim on one. She drizzled honey over both and set them on the table. Then poured coffee into tin cups and brought those over too. Silas looked at the food, did not touch it. "My grandmother," Grace said, sitting down across from him, "was a healer in Ireland before she came over. County Cork." His jaw tightened. She learned from her mother, and her mother learned from hers. 4 generations of women who knew how to use what grew in the ground. Grace picked up her spoon. She called it the old knowledge, said it went back further than anyone could remember. Miss Grace. She kept a book, wrote down everything she knew, everything her mother knew, recipes, remedies, treatments. Grace took a bite of oatmeal, swallowed. "I have that book. It is in my valise." Silas's hand lay flat on the table, fingers spread. She watched the tendons shift beneath the skin as he pressed down, like he was trying to anchor himself to the wood. "What is killing your horses?" she continued. "I have seen it before. Summer fever. My grandmother called it. It hits fast and hard, but it can be treated. Willow bark for the fever, peppermint to clear the lungs. You boil them together, let the horses drink it warm." "Stop." The word came out quiet, harder than if he had shouted. Grace stopped. Silas finally looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed, bloodshot, the eyes of a man who had spent too many nights watching things he loved slip away. "You have been here one day," he said. "One day. You do not know this land. You do not know these horses. You do not know me. I know what fever looks like in an animal. Do you?" He pushed the bowl away. It slid across the table and stopped against the salt cellar. "Doc Harmon has been a veterinarian for 30 years. 30 years in this county. He looked at my horses and said he had never seen anything like it. Said there was nothing he could do. Maybe he was wrong. And maybe you are a woman from Philadelphia who read some old book and thinks she knows better than everyone else." Silas stood. The chair scraped back, catching on an uneven board. "I do not need advice from someone who just got off a train. What I need is—" He stopped. His mouth worked, but nothing came out. "What do you need?" Grace asked. He stared at her. The silence stretched thin between them. Then he turned and walked out. The screen door banged. His boots thudded across the porch, down the steps, fading toward the stable. Grace sat alone at the table. The oatmeal cooled in its bowl, the honey congealing on the surface. The coffee sent up thin ribbons of steam that disappeared into the morning light. She picked up his untouched bowl, carried it to the basin, scraped the contents into the slop bucket, washed the bowl, dried it with a cloth, and placed it back in the cupboard, every movement precise, controlled. The way her grandmother had taught her to move when grief threatened to crack you open: keep your hands busy, and the rest will follow. The afternoon sun beat down without mercy. Grace stood at the kitchen window, watching. Silas had been in the stable since morning, coming out only once to draw water from the well. He had carried 2 buckets back inside, his arms straining with the weight. The neighbors had stopped coming by weeks ago. She had noticed that much: no tracks in the dirt road, no hoof prints by the fence, no visitors calling hello from the porch. Nobody wanted to catch whatever was killing the horses. Or maybe they had already given up on Silas. The way people give up on a man they reckon is finished. A sound reached her through the open window. Not a scream. Horses do not scream the way people do. But something close. A high, desperate whinny that cut off mid-note, like someone had closed a hand around its throat. Then Silas's voice, shouting something she could not make out. Grace was out the door before she knew she had moved. The stable doors stood open. She ran toward them, dust kicking up beneath her boots. The smell hit her 10 yards out worse than yesterday, thicker, sweeter with rot. Inside, Silas knelt in the 3rd stall. Bella, the young mare, the one Grace had noticed last night, breathing faster than the others. The horse lay on her side, legs stretched out rigid, neck arched back at an angle that did not look natural. Her eyes had rolled up, showing white. Foam flecked her muzzle, and her chest heaved in quick, shallow spasms. Silas had his hands on her neck, pressing down, trying to hold her still, but she was not fighting. She was seizing. Her whole body jerked and twitched, muscles firing in patterns that had nothing to do with will. "Come on," his voice cracked. "Come on, girl. Stay with me." Grace stopped at the stall entrance. Her hands gripped the wooden rail. Bella's legs kicked once, twice, then went still. The mare's chest rose one more time, held, let go, did not rise again. Silas stayed where he was, hands still pressed to the horse's neck. His shoulders shook. No sound came out of him, but his whole body trembled like a man standing in a January wind without a coat. Grace did not move, did not speak. The silence in the stable grew thick enough to choke on. Then Silas stood, turned, walked past her toward the center aisle of the stable. He stopped beside one of the support posts, thick pine, the bark still rough on its surface, and slammed his fist into it. The impact made a sound like a branch breaking. He hit it again, and again. His knuckles split on the 3rd blow, blood smearing across the pale wood. Grace watched from the stall entrance, 10 feet away, close enough to see the blood, far enough that he might not remember she was there. His fist dropped to his side, his forehead pressed against the post. His breath came in ragged gasps. Grace looked at Bella's body, at the 6 other horses lying in their stalls, at Drummer, still breathing but barely. His eyes closed against a world that had stopped making sense. Then she looked at the blood dripping from Silas's hand onto the stable floor. She thought about her grandmother's book, about the willow bark in her valise, about everything she had been told to keep quiet about, to hide, to pretend she did not know. She thought about what would happen if she did nothing, and she thought about what would happen if she did not ask permission. Grace waited until Silas buried Bella. She watched from the kitchen window as he dug the grave behind the stable, where the ground sloped down toward a stand of mesquite trees. The shovel rose and fell in a steady rhythm, dirt piling up beside the hole. It took him 2 hours in the afternoon heat, when he finished. He stood there with his hands on the shovel handle, head bowed, not moving. He did not come back to the house for supper. Grace ate alone cold beans from a can, the last of the biscuits she had found in the cupboard. She washed her plate, dried it, put it away. Then she went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed. Looking at her valise, she had made her decision somewhere between watching Bella die and watching Silas break his hand against that post, maybe earlier, maybe the moment she had stepped off that train and smelled sickness on the wind. She was not going to ask permission again. The creek ran east of the property, maybe a quarter-mile from the house. Grace set out at first light, before Silas stirred from wherever he had slept the stable. Probably. Or maybe the porch. She carried a wicker basket she had found in the pantry, the handle wrapped in cracked leather that bit into her palm. The land here looked nothing like Pennsylvania, flat and brown and endless, the horizon stretching out in every direction until it blurred into the pale sky. But water was water, and certain things grew near water no matter where you were. She found the creek by following the slight dip in the terrain, the way the grass grew greener in a narrow line cutting across the brown. The water ran shallow and clear over a bed of smooth stones, barely ankle-deep at its center, and along the banks, willows, not the great weeping willows of the east, with their long, trailing branches. These were smaller, scrappier desert willows, adapted to survive on less, but the bark was the same, gray on the outside, pale underneath. She would know that bark anywhere. Grace knelt at the water's edge and pulled out her grandmother's paring knife, small, the blade worn thin from decades of sharpening. She cut strips of bark from the lower branches, working carefully, taking only what she needed. The inner bark came away in long ribbons, white as bone, smelling faintly of wintergreen. She filled half the basket. The peppermint took longer to find. Wild mint did not announce itself the way cultivated plants did. She had to get down on her hands and knees, crawling along the creek bank, crushing leaves between her fingers and sniffing until she caught that sharp, clean scent. There, a patch of it growing in the shade of a cottonwood, the leaves small but potent. She harvested 2 handfuls, wrapping them in her handkerchief to keep them fresh. Chamomile she found by accident, a cluster of white flowers with yellow centers growing in a rocky patch where the creek bent south. Not much, but enough. The sun had climbed high by the time she started back. Sweat soaked through her dress at the small of her back, and her arms ached from reaching and cutting and pulling. The basket hung heavy at her side. She did not see Silas when she crossed the yard, did not look for him. The first night, she worked alone, the kitchen filled with steam as the water boiled. She had found a large pot in the cupboard cast iron, heavy enough that lifting it made her shoulders burn. The willow bark went in first, 2 big handfuls, the pieces floating on the surface before slowly sinking as they softened. She stirred with a wooden spoon, watching the water turn from clear to amber to a deep reddish brown. The smell rose up bitter, medicinal, nothing like the sweet herbal teas her grandmother used to make for company. This was medicine, real medicine. It was not supposed to taste good. When the liquid had reduced by half, she added the peppermint. The sharp scent cut through the bitterness, clearing her sinuses, making her eyes water. She strained the mixture through cheesecloth into a ceramic pitcher. The liquid came out dark and pungent, steaming in the cool night air. 11 o'clock. The house sat silent. No sound from the back room where Silas slept or did not sleep. Grace picked up the pitcher and the oil lamp and walked out into the darkness. The second night, she chose the 3 weakest horses. Not Drummer, he was too far gone, his breathing too shallow, his fever too high. She needed to start with the ones who still had strength to swallow. Cooper lay in the 4th stall, a chestnut gelding with a white blaze down his face. His eyes opened when she knelt beside him, but he did not lift his head, did not have the energy. Grace dipped a wooden ladle into the pitcher. The medicine had cooled to lukewarm. Her grandmother always said body temperature was best, warm enough to soothe but not hot enough to burn. She cradled Cooper's head in her lap, tilting it back slightly. The horse's nostrils flared at the smell, but he did not fight. She poured a small amount into the corner of his mouth, massaging his throat to encourage swallowing. He swallowed. She gave him more and more. Half a ladle at a time, pausing between each dose. She moved to the next horse, then the next. Her knees ached from the hard-packed dirt floor. Her arms trembled from holding up their heavy heads. The pitcher emptied, and she went back to the house to make more. By the time she finished, the sky had started to lighten in the east. The third night she went to Drummer. He lay where he had been for days now, in the corner of his stall where the straw was deepest. His ribs showed through his coat he had lost weight, the muscle wasting away while the fever ate at him from the inside. His breathing came slow and labored, each exhale a small surrender. Grace knelt beside him and set the lamp on the ground. The flame threw long shadows across the walls, making the stable feel like a church after hours empty and sacred and full of things that could not be spoken aloud. She dipped the ladle, lifted Drummer's head onto her lap, poured. Nothing. The liquid pooled in the corner of his mouth and dribbled out, running down his jaw into the straw. She tried again. Same result. And again. His throat would not work. The muscles had gone slack, too weak to swallow. Grace sat back. Her hands were shaking. Not from the cold, the night was warm enough, but from something else. Something that felt like watching a door close that she had been trying to hold open. She looked at Drummer's face, at his closed eyes, his still ears, the way his nostrils barely moved with each breath. And she started to sing. She did not plan it. The song just came, an old Irish lullaby her grandmother used to sing. Something about a soldier going to war and the woman waiting for him to come home. The words had faded over the years, worn smooth by time, but the melody remained, slow, sad. The kind of song you sing when there is nothing else left to do. Siwil, siwil, siwil arun. Her voice came out thin and rough, cracking on the high notes. She was not a singer, had never been. But the song kept coming anyway, filling the silence of the stable, wrapping around the sick horse like a blanket. She dipped the ladle again, poured, massaged his throat. Drummer swallowed. Grace stopped singing, stopped breathing. She poured again. He swallowed again, weak, barely there, but real. She started singing once more, softer now, the melody steadier. The medicine went down, 1 ladle, 2, 3. She did not hear the footsteps, did not know he was there until she paused between verses and caught the creak of a floorboard behind her. She turned her head, just slightly, and saw him in the shadows by the stable door. Silas, standing in the darkness, watching. She did not stop singing, did not acknowledge him, just turned back to Drummer and kept working, kept pouring, kept humming that old, sad song her grandmother had carried across an ocean. When the pitcher was empty, she stood. Her knees screamed, her back ached. She picked up the lamp and walked toward the door. Silas stepped aside to let her pass. Their eyes met for one moment, his red-rimmed and hollow, hers steady and tired. Neither of them spoke. Grace walked across the yard to the house, the lamp swinging at her side, her shadow stretching long behind her. She did not look back, but she knew he was still standing there, watching her go. Grace woke to the smell of coffee, not the cold, stale dregs she had been making for herself the past 3 mornings. This was fresh the rich, dark scent of beans ground and brewed within the hour. It drifted under her bedroom door, curled around her pillow, pulled her out of sleep. She lay still for a moment, listening. Footsteps in the kitchen, the clink of metal on metal, a chair scraping across the floor. Silas was awake, and he had made coffee. She dressed quickly, the brown wool this time, sturdier than the calico, better for walking through brush and kneeling in creek mud. Her hair went up in a simple knot at the back of her head, pinned with the 2 bone pins her grandmother had given her the Christmas before she died. When she opened the bedroom door, Silas stood at the kitchen window with his back to her. A cup of coffee sat on the table, steam rising from its surface. Beside it, a second cup. He turned at the sound of her footsteps. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The morning light came through the window at a low angle, catching the dust motes that hung suspended in the air between them. His hand was wrapped in a strip of white cloth. She could see blood seeping through at the knuckles where he had split them against the post. "I am going to the creek," Grace said. "I need more willow bark." Silas nodded slowly. His jaw worked, like he was chewing on words that did not want to come out. "Can I come with you?" Grace blinked. Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not that. "If you want." He did not move, just stood there, one hand wrapped around his coffee cup, the other hanging at his side with that bloody bandage. "I want," he said. Grace picked up the basket from where she had left it by the door. She held it out to him. "There's another one in the pantry, second shelf." He set down his coffee and went to get it. The walk to the creek took longer with 2 people. Not because Silas was slow, he moved through the brush with the easy familiarity of a man who had spent his whole life on this land, stepping over roots and ducking under branches without thinking. But he kept stopping, looking around, watching the way Grace navigated the terrain, the way her eyes scanned the ground and the bushes and the low-hanging limbs. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Halfway there. Everything." Grace ducked under a mesquite branch, its thorns catching at her sleeve. "My grandmother used to say the land tells you what it needs. You just have to know how to listen." Silas did not respond to that, but he stopped asking questions and started watching more closely. The willows stood where she had left them, their narrow leaves rustling in the slight morning breeze. The creek ran lower than it had 3 days ago. The summer heat was sucking the water out of everything, but it still flowed, clear and cool over the smooth stones. Grace could see minnows darting in the shallows, silver flashes against the brown. She knelt at the base of the nearest tree and pulled out her knife. "You want strips from the inner bark," she said, not looking up. "About as wide as your finger, as long as you can get them. Cut shallow, you do not want to kill the tree." She made the first cut, demonstrating. The blade slid under the outer bark, lifting it away to reveal the pale layer beneath. She peeled off a strip and held it up. "See how it is almost white? That is what you want. The outer bark is useless." Silas crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell him sweat and horse and something underneath. Something that might have been soap, or might have been just skin. He took the strip from her hand and turned it over, examining it. "Smells like mint. No, something else. Wintergreen. The salicin in the bark, it is related to aspirin. Reduces fever, eases pain." Grace cut another strip. "My grandmother called it poor man's aspirin. Said the fancy doctors in Dublin paid good money for pills that came from trees just like this one." She handed him the knife. His fingers brushed hers when he took it. Rough skin, calloused palms. He pulled back quickly, then positioned the blade against the bark, made a tentative incision. Too deep the knife bit into the heartwood beneath. Shallower. He adjusted, tried again. This time the strip came away clean, pale and smooth. Good. They worked in silence for a while. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. Sweat gathered at Grace's temples, at the small of her back. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. leaving a streak of dirt across her skin. Silas paused in his cutting, reached into his pocket and pulled out a square of white cloth. He held it out to her without a word. Grace took it. Linen, soft from many washings. One corner had been embroidered small blue flowers stitched in a pattern that looked handmade. A woman's work. She wiped her face with it. The fabric came away damp and dirty. Your mother's. Silas's hands had gone still on the bark. He nodded once, short and sharp. She used to wear it in her hair on Sundays, tied it in a bow at the back. He started cutting again, his voice flat, like he was reciting facts from a book he had read too many times. She would read from the Bible every night before bed, had her favorite passages marked with little pieces of ribbon. Psalm 23, the book of Ruth. She said Ruth reminded her of herself, a woman who left everything behind to follow someone to a strange land. Grace folded the handkerchief carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. When did she pass? When I was 12, fever. Same thing that is killing the horses, maybe. He stripped another piece of bark, not looking at her. Doc could not say for sure. Nobody could. The creek murmured beside them, water sliding over stones. Somewhere in the brush, a mockingbird ran through its stolen songs, a cardinal's whistle, a jay's screech, a meadowlark's trill, all jumbled together like a child showing off. Tell me about yours, Silas said. Your grandmother. Grace sat back on her heels. Her hands kept working, peeling bark, but her mind went somewhere else, somewhere green and wet and far away. Bridget O'Malley, born in County Cork, in a village so small it did not have a name, just a crossroads and a church. She dropped another strip into her basket. She was the healer for 3 parishes. People walked for miles to see her farmers with sick cattle, mothers with feverish children, old men with aches that would not quit. What did they call her? A bean fisa. It means wise woman. In the old language, some meant it as a compliment. Grace's mouth twisted. Others meant witch. Silas made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a grunt. Something in between. She left Ireland in 1844, right before the worst of the famine. Her mother had the sight. She used to say knew the potatoes would fail before the first black spots appeared. Told Bridget to take the book and go, while there was still money for passage. Grace pulled a handful of peppermint from the ground near the water's edge. She never went back. Never saw her mother again. Never forgot the hunger, either. Used to save every scrap of food, even when the pantry was full. Said you never knew when the lean times would come again. The sun had moved while they talked. Grace's shadow stretched longer now, pointing east toward the house. She handed Silas a piece of willow bark. Chew this. He looked at her, eyebrows raised. Go on. Chew it. It will taste bitter at first. Then your mouth will go numb. He put it between his teeth. Bit down. His face twisted, nose wrinkling, lips pulling back. Grace laughed. The sound surprised her. She had not laughed since when Philadelphia. Before that, the noise came out rusty, like a gate that had not been opened in years. Poor man's aspirin, she said. Tastes like it, too. Silas spat the bark into his palm, grimacing. But something had shifted in his face. The tight lines around his mouth had loosened. Just slightly. He almost looked like he might smile, almost. They walked home with full baskets. The sun had passed its peak by the time they reached the house, shadows starting to stretch eastward across the brown grass. Grace's shoulders ached from bending and cutting, and her thumb throbbed where the knife had slipped yesterday. But the baskets were heavy with willow bark and peppermint, and a handful of chamomile she had spotted growing near a rocky outcrop on the way back. Silas carried both baskets the last quarter mile. He had not asked, just reached over and took hers when he saw her shifting it from hand to hand to ease the weight. At the kitchen door, he set them down and straightened. "I will start the fire," he said. "You will need hot water for whatever it is you do with all this." Grace nodded. "Thank you." The word hung between them, carrying more weight than two syllables should. Silas went inside. A moment later, she heard the clatter of the stove grate, the scrape of a match, the soft whoosh of kindling catching flame. They ate supper together that night, not much cornbread that Grace had mixed and baked while the medicine simmered, the smell of it filling the kitchen like a warm memory. The way her grandmother's kitchen used to smell on winter evenings. Beans from a can, heated with salt pork until the fat rendered and the liquid thickened. Simple food, the kind that fills the belly without asking anything of the cook. Silas cleared his plate. Then he looked up at her across the table. "The oatmeal," he said. "The other morning. It was good." Grace did not answer, but something in her shoulders loosened. Some tension she had not known she was carrying. Outside. Frogs had started singing down by the creek. The sound drifted through the open window, a chorus of voices calling and answering in the darkness. Closer, crickets chirped in the grass near the porch. "I will check on the horses," Silas said, pushing back from the table. "Then I will help you with the medicine, if you want." Grace looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his hair at the temples, the way his hands rested on the table, palms down, fingers spread, like a man who had finally stopped bracing for a blow. "I want," she said. He nodded once and headed for the door. Grace started clearing the dishes. The water in the basin had gone cold, so she pumped more, heated it on the stove, added soap flakes from the tin by the window. The plates went in one by one, the grease lifting off in cloudy swirls. Through the window, she could see the stable. The doors stood open, lantern light spilling out onto the dirt. And then she heard it. A sound that made her hands go still in the water. A horse. Whinnying, not the weak, pitiful sound she had grown used to over the past week. This was different, stronger, almost healthy. Grace dried her hands on her apron and walked to the window. In the stable doorway, Silas stood frozen, staring at something inside. She could not see what, but she could see his face. And for the first time since she had arrived, he was smiling. Cooper was standing. Grace ran across the yard, her wet hands still dripping dishwater, and stopped at the stable door beside Silas. The chestnut gelding stood in his stall on 4 legs. Shaky. Yes, his knees trembled and his head hung low, but standing. For the first time in 8 days. Standing. Silas did not look at her. He kept staring at Cooper like the horse might dissolve if he blinked. "He got up about a minute ago," he said. His voice sounded strange, thick. "Just stood up, like it was nothing." Grace stepped into the stable. The smell had changed, still sick, still heavy. But underneath it now was something else. Something that smelled like effort and sweat and life holding on. She walked to Cooper's stall and touched his neck. Warm. Not burning, just warm. "The fever is breaking," she said, behind her. Silas made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound something caught in his throat that could have been anything. 3 more horses stood by the next morning. Jackson, old Pete, a gray mare named Sable that Grace had not paid much attention to because she had seemed stronger than the others from the start. Drummer stayed down, but his breathing had changed. Slower now, deeper, the wet rattle fading to something that sounded almost normal. When Grace knelt beside him to check his pulse, His ear twitched toward her voice. "He is fighting," she told Silas. "Give him time." They worked through the day together. Silas hauled water from the well while Grace brewed medicine in the kitchen. They moved between the house and the stable in a rhythm that felt passing each other in the yard without needing to speak. By noon, the heat had turned brutal. The air sat heavy and still, pressing down like a wet wool blanket. Grace's dress clung to her back, and sweat ran down Silas's face in steady streams that dripped off his chin onto his shirt. At 4 o'clock, the sky changed. Grace noticed at first a darkness gathering on the western horizon. Purple-black and thick, moving fast. She had seen storms like this in Pennsylvania, but never one that came on so quick. One minute the sun blazed overhead, the next, it vanished behind a wall of cloud that swallowed the light whole. "Get inside," Silas said. He was standing at the well, the bucket still in his hands, staring at the approaching storm. "Now, the horses. I will handle the horses. Get inside." Grace did not move. The wind hit before she could answer a gust that came out of nowhere and nearly knocked her off her feet. Her skirt whipped around her legs, tangling, and she grabbed the porch rail to steady herself. The temperature dropped. 10 degrees in 10 seconds, maybe more. The sweat on her skin went cold. "Silas!" But he was already running toward the stable. Grace ran after him. Grace ran. The stable doors had blown open. They banged against the outer walls, the hinges screaming, the wood cracking with each impact. Inside, the horses were panicking. Those that could stand were rearing and kicking at their stall doors, and those that could not were thrashing on the ground, eyes rolling white. Silas grabbed the nearest door and fought to close it. The wind tore at the wood, ripping it from his hands. He grabbed it again, braced his shoulder against it, shoved. Grace took the other door. The metal handle bit into her palms, cold and slick with the first drops of rain. She pulled with everything she had, her boots sliding in the dirt, her arms burning. The doors came together. Silas dropped the wooden bar into place, locking them shut. For one moment, everything went quiet. Then the rain hit. Not drop sheets. Water falling so thick and fast it sounded like gravel thrown against the roof. The stable shook with the force of it. Somewhere overhead, Wood groaned. "Help me move them!" Silas shouted over the noise. He was already in Cooper's stall, trying to coax the horse toward the back corner, away from the doors. The far stalls are more sheltered. A crack split the air. Grace looked up. The roof was coming apart. The wind had gotten under the shingles somehow, peeling them back like dead skin. A section of boards lifted, twisted, and tore free, spinning away into the darkness outside. Rain poured through the gap, a waterfall of cold water crashing down onto the straw below, onto Drummer's stall. "No." Silas's voice broke on the word. He ran. Grace followed. Drummer lay where he had been all week, in the corner of his stall, where the straw was deepest. But now water cascaded down onto him, soaking his coat, pooling around his body, turning the straw into a cold, sodden mess that smelled of rot and mud. His eyes had gone wide, wild with fear, and his legs were moving, not the weak twitches she had seen before. This was violent, uncontrolled. His whole body seized, muscles locking and releasing in rapid spasms that made his hooves strike the ground in staccato bursts. Silas dropped to his knees beside the horse. Water splashed up around him, soaking his trousers, his shirt, everything. He grabbed Drummer's head, trying to hold it still, trying to keep the animal from hurting himself. "Easy, boy, easy, easy." Drummer's back arched, his neck twisted at an angle that looked wrong, unnatural. A sound came out of him, not a whinny, not a scream, something worse, and then his whole body went rigid and stopped. Everything stopped. The rain kept falling, the wind kept howling, but Drummer did not move. Silas stayed where he was, hands still gripping the horse's mane. Water poured down on both of them, running in streams across his shoulders, down his back, pooling around his knees. His shirt had turned translucent, plastered to his skin. Drummer. His voice came out barely above a whisper. Drummer. Come on. Come on, boy. Nothing. He shook the horse's head, gentle at first, then harder. Come on. Wake up. Wake up. Nothing. Silas bent over Drummer, his forehead pressing against the horse's neck. His shoulders began to shake. His breath came in gasps that sounded like drowning. Grace stood at the stall entrance, rain pouring down on her, watching. She had never seen a man break before. Not like this. This was not crying. This was something deeper, something uglier, great racking sobs that seemed to tear themselves out of his chest, sounds that did not belong to language or reason. His whole body curled around the horse, around this animal he had had for 20 years, and he wept the way a child weeps when the world has shown him something he was not ready to see. His hands clawed at Drummer's mane, tangling in the wet hair, pulling, as if he could drag the horse back from wherever it had gone. His face contorted, mouth open, eyes squeezed shut, rain and tears and snot running together until there was no telling which was which. Please. The word came out broken. Please. Not him. Not him, too. Grace stepped into the stall. The water came up over her boots, cold and brown with dissolved straw and dirt and manure. Her skirt dragged heavy against her legs, the fabric pulling her down. She lost her footing and went to one knee, her hand plunging into the muck up to her wrist. She did not stop. She crawled the last few feet to where Silas knelt. The mud sucked at her dress, at her hands. The smell of it filled her nose, earth and rot and animal waste. She could feel it seeping through her clothes, cold against her skin. She reached Silas and put her hand on Drummer's neck. The horse's coat was slick with rain, matted flat against the muscle beneath. She pressed her fingers into the groove below his jaw, feeling for the pulse point her grandmother had shown her 30 years ago in a barn in Pennsylvania. Nothing. She pressed harder, shifted her fingers. Tried again. There. Faint. Irregular. But there. Silas. He did not respond, did not lift his head, just kept making those awful sounds. His face buried against Drummer's neck, his hands still tangled in the mane. Grace grabbed his shoulder. Her fingers dug into the wet fabric, the muscle beneath. She pulled him upright, forcing him to look at her. His face was a ruin, eyes swollen, nose running, mouth slack. Mud streaked his cheeks where he had pressed his face against the ground. He looked like something that had crawled out of a grave. "He is alive," Grace said. "His heart is still beating." Silas stared at her. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. "He is alive," she said again. "But I need your help. I need you to get up. Can you do that? Can you get up?" The rain kept falling. The wind howled through the gap in the roof. Somewhere in the stable, a horse screamed. Silas looked down at Drummer, at his hands, still tangled in the horse's mane, at the water rising around them both, brown and cold and smelling of death. Then he looked back at Grace. Her dress was ruined. Mud covered her arms up to the elbows. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wet ropes around her face. She looked as broken as he felt, but her eyes were steady, and her hand was still on his shoulder. He nodded. The rain stopped at 10 o'clock. Grace knew because she had been counting the drops that fell through the hole in the roof, counting the seconds between Drummer's breaths, counting anything she could count, because counting meant thinking, and thinking meant not giving up. The silence when the rain ended felt louder than the storm. They had moved Drummer to the driest corner of the stall, not alone, but together. Both of them soaked through and shivering, their hands slipping on the wet hide as they lifted and pulled and dragged. The horse weighed over 1,000 pounds. Neither of them should have been able to move him, but they did. Now they sat on either side of him, their backs against the wooden walls of the stall, their legs stretched out in the wet straw. Water still dripped from the broken roof, but it fell in the center of the aisle now, missing them, missing Drummer. Grace's dress clung to her skin like a second layer of cold flesh. Her teeth chattered. Her fingers had gone numb 20 minutes ago, and the mud on her arms had started to dry, cracking when she moved. She did not move to go inside. Neither did Silas. "I will get blankets," he said finally. His voice came out rough, scraped raw from crying. "And the small stove from the back room. We can set it up in here. I will stay with him." Silas looked at her. Water still dripped from his hair, running down his face in thin streams. In the lamplight, he looked 10 years older than he had this morning. His eyes were swollen, his cheeks streaked with dried mud and salt. "I will be quick," he said. He pushed himself up. His boots squelched in the wet straw. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading across the yard toward the house. Grace turned back to Drummer. The horse lay still, his breathing shallow but steady. She reached out and touched his neck, still warm, but not burning. The seizure had taken something out of him. She could see it in the way his muscles had gone slack, the way his eyes stayed closed even when she spoke to him. She bowed her head. The words came without thinking, not out loud, just in her mind. The way her grandmother had taught her to pray when she was small. No fancy phrases, no thee and thou, just talking. The way you would talk to someone who was listening. "Lord, I do not know if you hear me. I do not know if you listen to women like me, women who work with roots and bark instead of proper medicine. But this man has lost so much already. His mother, his wife, his horses, one by one. Please, not this one, not Drummer. Let him live. Let something live." She did not know how long she sat there with her head bowed. Long enough that she heard Silas's footsteps returning across the yard. Long enough that the cold had seeped into her bones and settled there like an old friend. She lifted her head and got back to work. Silas came back with his arms full. 2 wool blankets, the kind Grace's grandmother would have called horse blankets, thick, rough, smelling faintly of cedar from the trunk they had been stored in, a small cast-iron stove, the kind you could carry with one hand if you were strong enough, a tin coffee pot, a bag of grounds, a ceramic pitcher full of the medicine Grace had brewed that morning. He set up the stove in the corner of the stall, away from the straw, on a bare patch of dirt floor. The chimney pipe went out through a gap in the wall boards that looked like it had been made for exactly this purpose. "Pa used to do this," Silas said, striking a match. "When the mares were foaling in winter, he would sit out here all night with this stove and a pot of coffee, waiting." The kindling caught. Flame licked up, orange and yellow, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Grace wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders. The wool scratched against her wet skin, but it held warmth, and warmth was what she needed. She pulled it tighter, feeling the shivering start to ease. Silas draped the other blanket over Drummer's body, tucking the edges under the horse's flanks. Then he sat down across from Grace, his back against the opposite wall, and watched the stove flame grow. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just present. The fire crackled. The wind had died down outside. and the only sounds were the dripping of water from the broken roof and the slow, steady breathing of the horse between them. "You asked me once," Grace said, "why I left Philadelphia." Silas looked up. "I told you about the pharmacy, about being fired." She pulled the blanket tighter. That was not the whole truth. The stove crackled. Somewhere outside, water dripped from the eaves. "I was not just fired," Grace said. "I was ruined. Mr. Pemberton, the owner, he told everyone I had been stealing from him. Medicine, money, whatever story made people angriest that day. He took out an advertisement in the newspaper, warning other businesses not to hire me." Her voice stayed flat, factual. "The way you talk about things that happened to someone else. A long time ago. I could not find work. Anywhere. Not as a clerk. Not as a seamstress. Not even as a washerwoman. Everyone had heard the stories. Everyone believed them." She stared at the stove flame, watching it dance. "My grandmother had been dead for 3 years by then. I had no family, no money, no friends who would risk being seen with me." "Why did he do it?" Silas asked. "Pemberton." Grace's mouth twisted. Not quite a smile. "Because I was right. About a treatment he had been selling. It was poison, literally. Actual poison. Arsenic in a tonic he claimed cured everything from consumption to bad nerves. I told him it was killing people. And he—" She stopped, drew a breath. "He could not let a woman be right about something like that. So he destroyed me instead." The fire popped. A log shifted, sending up a shower of sparks. Grace dipped the wooden ladle into the pitcher and lifted Drummer's head onto her lap. The horse's muzzle was cold against her thighs. She poured a small amount of medicine into the corner of his mouth, massaging his throat the way she had done 100 times this week. He swallowed, weak but real. "So you answered an advertisement," Silas said slowly. "In a newspaper, for a mail-order bride." "I answered 12 advertisements." Grace poured another dose. "You were the only one who wrote back." At 3 o'clock in the morning, Silas made coffee. He poured water from a canteen into the pot and set it on the small stove. The liquid hissed when it hit the hot metal. Steam rose, mixing with the smell of smoke and wet straw and horse. Grace took the cup he offered. Black, bitter, too hot to drink. She wrapped her hands around it anyway, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. "Why did you answer my letter?" she asked. "Out of all the women who must have written." Silas poured his own cup, held it without drinking. "Honestly, yes. Because you did not lie." He stared into the dark liquid. "All the other letters I got, they were full of pretty words, descriptions of how beautiful they were, how accomplished, how perfect, like they were selling themselves at auction." He took a sip, grimaced at the heat. "Your letter just said you could cook and clean and keep house, said you were not fancy and did not need fancy things, said you hoped that would be enough." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "That was the first honest thing anyone had written to me in a long time." Grace thought about the letter she had sent, the hours she had spent writing and rewriting it, trying to figure out what to say to a stranger who might become her husband. All the words she had crossed out, all the stories she had decided not to tell. "I almost did not send it," she admitted. "I wrote it a dozen times, kept throwing it away." "What made you send it?" She looked at Drummer, at the slow rise and fall of his ribs under the blanket. "I ran out of paper," she said. "Could not afford to buy more, so I sent what I had." Silas made a sound, almost a laugh. If laughs could sound that tired and sad at the same time. Funny how things work out. At 4 o'clock, Grace gave Drummer another dose of medicine. She had been doing it every 15 minutes since they set up the stove, small amounts. Just a few spoonfuls at a time, wrote to help him swallow. Most of it went down. Some dribbled out the corner of his mouth, soaking into the blanket. But he swallowed. That was the important thing. He swallowed. The fire had burned down to embers. Silas added more wood, and the flames leaped up again, throwing fresh light across the stall. "Tell me about her," Grace said. "Your wife—" Silas's hands went still on the firewood. He did not look at her. "Sarah." The name came out soft. Sarah Ann Drifter, née Collins. "We were married in the spring of 1877 in the little church in town. She wore her mother's dress. I wore my father's suit, even though it was too big in the shoulders." He sat back, staring at the fire. "She wanted children, wanted to plant a garden behind the house, vegetables, maybe some flowers. She had all these plans. What happened? Fever, spring of 1879. His voice had gone flat again, reciting. "Same kind of fever that has been killing my horses. Maybe—" Doc could not say for sure. Said it might be one thing, might be another, might be nothing he had ever seen before. He picked up a piece of straw and turned it over in his fingers. "I sat with her for 3 days. Did not sleep, did not eat. Just sat there and held her hand and watched her slip away. One breath at a time." He snapped the straw in half. "She was 23 years old. We had been married 2 years. And then she was gone. And I was here. And nothing made sense anymore." Grace did not say anything. There was nothing to say. She knew that kind of grief, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone and never quite goes away, no matter how many years pass. Silas looked at Drummer. "After she died, I stopped caring. About the ranch. About the horses. About anything." He dropped the broken straw. "I let this place fall apart around me because I could not figure out why it mattered anymore. What was the point of building something if it could just be taken away?" "And then you wrote the advertisement," Grace said. "And then I wrote the advertisement." He nodded slowly. "I thought maybe if someone else was here, maybe that would be enough to make me start again." Outside, far in the distance, a coyote howled. The sound floated across the empty land, high and lonesome, the cry of something wild calling to its own kind in the darkness. Another voice answered, then another, a chorus of lonely souls singing to the night. Grace shivered, though the stove had warmed the air around them. "Do you think it worked?" she asked. "Having someone else here?" Silas looked at her. The firelight caught his eyes, made them glow like amber. "I do not know yet," he said. "Ask me tomorrow." At 5 o'clock, the sky began to change. Grace had been watching the hole in the roof, the square of blackness where the stars had been visible earlier. Now the black was softening, lightening, the first hint of gray creeping in at the edges. She had not slept. Neither had Silas. They had talked through the night about Ireland and Pennsylvania and Texas, about grandmothers who knew too much and husbands who died too young, about letters and trains and the strange paths that bring people together. And in between the talking, they had worked. Medicine every 15 minutes, fresh water for the stove, more wood on the fire. Drummer had not moved, had not opened his eyes, but he had kept breathing, kept swallowing, kept holding on. Grace dipped the ladle one more time, lifted his head, poured. The first light of dawn came through the hole in the roof, a single beam, pale and thin, cutting through the dusty air. It fell across Drummer's face, across his closed eyes. The horse blinked. Grace froze. The ladle hung suspended over his muzzle. Forgotten. Drummer blinked again. His eyes opened cloudy at first, unfocused. The way they get when something comes back from a long way away. Then his ear moved. Not the tiny twitch she had seen before. A full rotation, turning toward the sound of her breathing. Then his tail. A weak flick, barely disturbing the blanket draped over his hindquarters. Then his eyes found Silas, and stayed there. Silas. Grace's voice came out as a whisper. Silas, look. He was already looking, already staring at Drummer with an expression she could not read, hope and fear and something else. Something that might have been the beginning of belief. He sees you, Grace said. He knows you are here. Drummer made a sound. Not a whinny, he was too weak for that. Just a soft exhale. A breath that carried something more than air. Recognition. Maybe. Or gratitude. Or just the simple acknowledgement that he was still alive. And so was the man sitting beside him. Grace realized she was holding Silas's hand. She did not remember reaching for it. Did not remember the moment their fingers had intertwined. But there it was, her hand in his. Their palms pressed together, her calluses against his calluses, the warmth of his skin seeping into hers. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. He was not looking at their hands, he was looking at her, and he did not let go. 1 month later, the roof was fixed. Silas had spent 3 weeks on it, climbing up every morning with a hammer and nails, working until the sun got too hot, then climbing back down to help Grace with the horses. The new shingles sat lighter in color than the old ones, a patchwork of fresh cedar against weathered gray. It looked uneven. It looked repaired. It looked like something that had been broken and put back together by hands that cared. Grace stood at the kitchen window, drying the last of the breakfast dishes, watching him cross the yard toward the stable. His gait had changed over the past few weeks. The heavy, dragging steps she had seen when she first arrived had given way to something quicker, more certain, like a man who had somewhere to be and a reason to get there. Drummer met him at the stable door. The horse stood on all 4 legs, now had been standing for 3 weeks. Ever since that morning after the storm when he had lifted his head and looked at Silas with those cloudy eyes that slowly cleared. He still moved stiff. Still favored his left hind leg when he walked too fast. But he walked. He ate. He followed Silas around the yard like a dog following its master, nickering softly whenever the man came into view. 12 horses had survived. 2 had not made it Jackson, who had seemed strong until the end, and a spotted mare named Penny, who had never stood up after the first week. Silas had buried them beside Bella, behind the stable, where the ground sloped down toward the mesquite trees. 3 graves in a row, marked with wooden crosses he had carved himself. He had said a prayer over each one, simple words, the kind his mother would have used. Grace had stood beside him, head bowed, listening. But 12 had lived. 12 out of 15. More than Grace had dared to hope for when she had knelt in that stable the first night, counting the sick ones by lamplight. She hung the dish towel on its hook and turned from the window. The kitchen smelled different now, not just coffee and bacon and the familiar sense of cooking underneath those. Something greener, sharper. The smell of herbs drying on racks she had built from scrap wood and twine. Willow bark hung in bundles near the window where the air moved best. Peppermint and chamomile filled jars along the shelf, the same plants she had been gathering all month, preparing for whatever might come next. A knock at the front door pulled her out of her thoughts. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room. The floorboards did not creak as much as they used to. Silas had fixed those too. One rainy afternoon, when the ground was too wet for outdoor work, old Murphy stood on the porch. He was a small man, weathered and wiry, with a face like a dried apple and hands that never stopped moving. Grace had seen him twice before, once at the feed store in town, once riding past on the main road, but they had never spoken. "Ma'am," he pulled off his hat, revealing a scalp burned pink by the sun. "Sorry to bother you. I was hoping, I heard—" He stopped. His hands turned the hat brim around and around. "My calf," he said finally. "She is sick. Will not eat. Will not stand. The vet from town came out. But he could not figure what is wrong with her." He looked at Grace with eyes that had seen too many seasons to hold any pride. "Folks say you know about these things, about healing. I thought maybe—" "Where is she?" Murphy blinked. "Ma'am, the calf. Where is she?" "In my barn. About 2 miles north." Grace untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the door. "Let me get my bag." She did not get back until afternoon. The calf had been easier than the horses younger, smaller, and the sickness had not had time to dig in deep. A simple tea of chamomile and honey, administered every few hours, and instructions for Murphy to keep the animal warm and dry. Nothing complicated. Nothing her grandmother would not have done without thinking twice. But Murphy had looked at her like she had performed some kind of wonder. Silas was on the porch when she rode up, sitting in the rocking chair with a cup of coffee balanced on his knee. He did not stand when she dismounted, just watched her loop the reins around the post and climb the steps. "Murphy's calf," he asked. "She will be fine. Just needed some help getting through the worst of it." Grace sat down on the bench across from him. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun, and she could feel the heat soaking through her dress, loosening the muscles in her back that had gone tight from riding. "He is the third one this week," Silas said. Grace nodded. Word traveled fast in small communities. First it had been the Hendersons, asking about their laying hens. Then the widow Carter, whose milk cow had stopped producing. Now Murphy. Each one showing up at the door with the same hesitant look, the same reluctance to ask, the same surprise when help was actually given. "You could charge them," Silas said. "Money or trade. People would pay. I know. But you will not." Grace looked out at the yard. The stable doors stood open, and she could see the horses inside, some standing in their stalls, some wandering in the paddock out back. Drummer had his head over the fence, watching them, his ears pricked forward. "My grandmother never charged," she said. "She said knowledge was meant to be shared, not hoarded. Said the minute you put a price on healing, you stop being a healer and start being a merchant." Silas did not answer. He lifted his coffee cup and took a long sip. A breeze moved through the yard, carrying the smell of grass and dust and horses. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its clear, sweet song. "I finished the shed," Silas said. Grace looked at him. "The one behind the kitchen. I put in shelves. For your jars." He set down the coffee cup. "Figured you might need more space. For the herbs and things." Grace stood up and walked around the side of the house. The shed had been a storage building, small, cramped, full of rusted tools and broken harnesses that Silas had been meaning to sort through for years. She had seen it once, the second day she was here, and had not thought about it since. Now it was something else. The walls had been whitewashed. The floor had been swept clean and covered with fresh planks. Shelves lined 3 of the walls, built from the same cedar as the new roof shingles, sanded smooth so they would not snag the glass jars she would be placing on them. A small window had been cut into the east wall, letting in the afternoon light. A workbench sat beneath it, sturdy and level, with a small stool tucked underneath. Grace stood in the doorway and did not say anything. Silas had followed her around the house. He stood behind her now, not quite close enough to touch. "It is not much," he said. "But I thought you need somewhere to work, somewhere that is yours." Grace stepped inside, ran her fingers along the nearest shelf. The wood was smooth and cool beneath her fingertips. On the workbench, she noticed something she had not seen from the doorway. A small object wrapped in brown paper. She picked it up, unwrapped it. A wind chime, made from old horseshoes, 3 of them, strung on leather cord, with a small iron ring at the center to catch the breeze. "Found those in the barn," Silas said. "They were Drummer's, from years back, when he was young. Thought maybe you would want something to remember this summer by." Grace hung the chime on a nail by the window. The shoes clinked together, a soft, metallic sound that seemed to fill the small space with music. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a square of white cloth, linen, soft from many washings. One corner embroidered with small blue flowers, his mother's handkerchief. She hung it on a peg beside the window, where the light would catch the embroidery and make it glow. Silas made a sound behind her when she turned. His eyes were wet. They sat on the porch as the sun went down. The sky turned orange, then pink, then a deep purple that faded into black at the edges. The horizon stretched flat and endless, the way it only does in Texas, a straight line where earth meets sky, unbroken by hills or trees or anything at all. Drummer stood in the paddock with the rest of the herd. His head lifted every few minutes to check on the 2 figures on the porch. When the first stars appeared, he whinnied once, strong and clear, the sound echoing across the empty land. Crickets had started singing in the grass. A barn owl called from somewhere near the stable, its voice low and hollow. In the distance, coyotes began their evening chorus, yipping and howling to each other across the miles. Grace sat in the rocking chair, the one with the worn armrests and the creak that came every time she pushed back. Silas stood beside her, leaning against the porch post, watching the last light fade from the western sky. "Do you want to stay?" His voice came out quiet, almost lost in the sounds of the evening. Grace looked up at him. "Are you asking me, or are you asking my hands?" Silas laughed. A real laugh, the first one she had heard from him in all the weeks she had been here. It changed his face, softened the lines around his eyes, made him look like a younger man, a man who had not yet lost everything. "I am asking you," he said, "not because of the letter, not because you saved my horses, because—" He stopped, looked down at his boots, then back at her. "Because I cannot imagine this place without you anymore." Grace did not answer. She stood up from the rocking chair, walked into the house, came back out with 2 cups of coffee, steam rising from both. She set one in Silas's hand. Then she sat down on the porch step beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her sleeve. That was her answer. They sat there together as the stars came out, one by one, filling the Texas sky with light. The wind chime clinked softly from the shed behind the house. Drummer nickered from the paddock. The coyotes sang their lonesome songs. And somewhere in the garden behind the kitchen, where Grace had turned the soil last week and planted seeds she had been saving, the first green shoots were pushing up through the earth, waiting for morning. The end. This story came to me the way most good stories do, as a whisper, not a shout. A quiet tale about 2 people who found each other at the exact moment they needed finding most. I wrote it for those of us who have ever felt too proud to accept help, for those who carry old knowledge in our bones and wonder if anyone still needs it. For those who believe that healing of bodies, of hearts, of broken things is still possible, even when the world tells us otherwise. Thank you for walking this dusty road with Silas and Grace. For everyone who ever loved someone enough to stay when leaving would have been easier. Disclaimer. This work is inspired by classic Western tales of the American frontier and the tradition of mail-order brides created solely for entertainment purposes. The author does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters, including Silas Drifter and Grace Sullivan, are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or to real events is purely coincidental. The herbal remedies described in this story are fictional narrative elements and should not be considered medical advice. The Storyteller.